Sorry, start the broadcast.
I don't see that option anymore. I think it's only on your end.
Okay, I'll take it over. All right, here we go, Sharnice.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sharnice Peters, and I am a Policy Program Analyst for the Division of Energy Assistance within the Office of Community Services. On behalf of OCS, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, providing a 60-minute presentation on LIHEAP 101, Basics of Operating a LIHEAP Program. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is based on content that was shared in June at the National Energy and Utility Affordability Conference, or NEUAC. This webinar is designed to be useful for new LIHEAP managers and staff, as well as those interested in seeing what information was shared. We hope that by the end of this webinar, all participants today will better understand 3 key aspects of LIHEAP. First, the webinar will discuss some of the basic rules, guidelines, and considerations every grantee must account for when designing and delivering LIHEAP. Second, the presenters will describe different ways that grantees can interpret federal statutes and their particular laws when implementing LIHEAP. And third, the webinar will show you how to access and use resources like LIHEAP Virtual Library to learn about the LIHEAP basics and program administration. Next slide, please. Today's webinar has 3 main topics. First, David Carroll from Apprise will present on program basics for LIHEAP, including the federal statute and the role of state laws and program design considerations. Second, Lisa Gobin from Oregon will share with you about Oregon's program administration. Because Lisa was not available for today's webinar, we will be playing a video of her content. Third, you will hear from 2 state representatives and 1 community action partnership representative who will each provide different examples of their LIHEAP program and partnerships. Next slide, please. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the webinar using the GoToWebinar question box, which is shown here. We'll make time at the end of the webinar to answer questions, and if needed, we will also follow up with you about questions after the webinar. Next slide, please. For your reference, this presentation includes information and graphs that are taken from the LIHEAP Virtual Library. The LIHEAP Virtual Library is a public tool that can help you find information and resources based on the topic area you're interested in. You can find this virtual library on the homepage of the LIHEAP Performance Management website on the right corner as shown here. Finally, I'd just like to say that we appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and we hope that this is helpful for those new to or experienced with LIHEAP. With that, I'll hand it over to David. Take it away, David.
Hi, David Carroll here from Apprise. Before we get started, we have a quick poll for you to help us get an understanding of who's on the call today. We want to know how many years you have been working with the LIHEAP program in any capacity. Roberta will pull up the poll and you can click on the appropriate response and we'll give you a minute to do that, and then we'll give you feedback as to who's on the call. So go ahead and click on whichever category is consistent with your experience with LIHEAP in any capacity. Less than 2 years, 2 to 4 years, 5 to 10 years, or more than 10 years. So do we have results, Roberto or Dan? Okay, so quite This is something that we were expecting. Quite a number of individuals working in LIHEAP have been involved in less than 2 years, and more than 3/4, and about 3/4 are less than 5 years. And so something that we've been talking about with OCS is that it's really important to keep delivering training because the staff who are running LIHEAP continues to change. And it's just really important to do as much training as possible so that everybody has the information they need to run programs effectively. Next slide, please. As Charnice said, this presentation was delivered at the NEUAC conference. The presentation was designed by members of the LIHEAP Performance Management Implementation Work Group. The primary purpose of the presentation was to give stakeholders a better understanding of what it means that a LIHEAP program is a block grant. Because LIHEAP is a block grant, each state has considerable amount of flexibility in how it designs and implements its program. But at the same time, the PMIWG grantees wanted program stakeholders to understand that there are certain assurances or requirements associated with the LIHEAP program. The PMIWG wanted to repeat this presentation for 2 reasons. First, they know that there are lots of new program managers that they expect will find this information useful. But second, they wanted to make sure you heard what information was delivered to stakeholders so you can be aware of why a stakeholder might be asking certain questions. Next slide, please. In this section, we'll talk about some of the basic factors that all LIHEAP grantees must consider when designing and implementing LIHEAP. These include the LIHEAP assurances, other federal statutory rules and guidelines, individual state statutes and rules, and factors unique to state, territorial, and tribal communities. Next slide, please. During and after this presentation, participants are encouraged to learn more about LIHEAP by visiting the LIHEAP Virtual Library. As Charnice mentioned previously, a link to the virtual library can be found on the ACF LIHEAP homepage, the LIHEAP Performance Management website, and the LIHEAP Clearinghouse website. The LIHEAP Virtual Library is an excellent resource for anyone seeking training and technical assistance on developing, planning, and administering a LIHEAP program, as well as how performance management fits into the process. On this slide, you see the program basics section of the LIHEAP Virtual Library. When you select this option, it populates 3 questions. What are the basic LIHEAP fiscal responsibilities under the law? What requirements and guidance does OCS provide to grantees under the law? What are key activities should I undertake each year to comply with the law? And so what I'm going to be talking about are the LIHEAP assurances, and that if you click on the LIHEAP basic responsibilities under the law, you will see both a list of the assurances, and you'll see a very good 90-minute presentation that Melissa Torgerson delivered at the 2019 Denver training, in-person training session about each individual assurance. Next slide. So as you know, grant recipients are required to submit a model plan each year in September. The model plan is essentially a funding application where you detail how you will use federal funds you receive in accordance with the law. The 16 assurances are commitments that you make to abide by the legal requirements that go along with receiving and using these funds. If we take a close look at the LIHEAP plan, you'll see how many sections of LIHEAP model plan correspond to specific assurances. Next slide. So, given the time, again, I'll encourage you to go look at Melissa's 90-minute training on the assurances, which Brian Sarenson from Washington says he looks at every year when he's writing out his plan and making sure that he's following all the assurances. I'll not run through each of those assurances, but I do want to point out how they go hand in hand with the LIHEAP model plan. So for example, assurance 1 involves determining which program components you will administer for your specific program: heating, cooling, crisis, and/or weatherization, and how and when you will allocate those funds. you'll find that section 1 of the model plan, program components, meets this assurance, because this is where you explain the specific components of your program, how much of your funds you plan to allocate to each of those components, and specify the period you plan to run those service. So please take time to review each of these assurances. If you have any questions, be sure to follow up with your OCS liaison, because they will be able to assist you. Next slide. So one assurance you might find particularly challenging is assurance 9, that limits your program to spending only 10% of the funds on program administration. Note that this is not something imposed by HHS. Rather, this was part of the original statute and becomes one of the assurances that you'll need to follow and guarantee that you will abide by in your program plan. Next slide. The federal statute provides grantees with what Melissa likes to call fence posts when designing the programs. They leave a lot of room for flexibility. There are certain limits to what you can do, who you can allow to be included in your program. For example, is limited to the federal statutory maximum. But the federal regulations indicate that grantees have the primary responsibility for interpreting the federal law as it relates to their administration of LIHEAP, and that HHS will defer to their interpretation unless it is deemed to be clearly erroneous. Next slide. While the federal statute provides outer bounds for grantees, state and tribal law can also influence or restrict the design and delivery of programs. For example, the federal statute allows income eligibility up to the greater of 60% of state median income or 150% of poverty. However, some states have enacted laws that make their LIHEAP laws or regulations that make their LIHEAP income eligibility much lower than that. However, I'll also note that there's the statute has an upper limit of the greater of 60% of state median income or 150% of poverty. It also has a lower limit. You can't have a limit. You can't have a threshold that's below 110% of poverty. So within that, the state has a lot of opportunity to make decisions. And so it's always a balance between what are the federal guidelines and assurances that you have to abide by, and then what are your individual state laws. Next slide. Other factors aside from federal and state law are taken into consideration when designing and delivering the programs. Some of these by each grantee. Some of these include what are the client needs? What other energy assistance and weatherization resources are available in your state or tribal area? What's your climate? Is it primarily heating? Is it primarily cooling? Or for those of you who are living in the center of the country this year, is it both? What types of fuels are used by households in your jurisdiction, and what are the costs? And what are the different geographies within your state? Let's take a look at an example of how these factors fit together. Next slide. So for example, assurance 1, this assurance states that the funds grantees receive for LIHEAP must be used only for purposes explicitly authorized in the law. These include heating and/or cooling assistance, crisis assistance, weatherization and energy-related home repairs, outreach to households with the lowest income and the highest energy needs, and planning, development, and administration, including leveraging. Next slide. And so grantees in your plan that will be filed later this week, or maybe some of you have already done that, which program you'll need to tell HHS, which program components will be administered by your state, how much funding will be allocated to each component, when each component will be offered, winter versus, for example, winter versus year-round crisis, and what each component will include. So for example, in crisis, Some states include both equipment repair and bill payment, or others, while other states have bill payment only. And you can see that there's really a substantial difference in individual states. So 51 of the 54 states offer heating assistance. The lowest percent allocated is 5%, probably by a state in a warmer area, and the highest percent is 78%. Only 32 of the 54 states this was a table that we generated from 2018 plans, allocated funds to cooling. The smallest amount was 1%, the highest amount was 84%. So you can see that whatever you do is likely to be unique. States make decisions according to their own needs. Next slide. So when determining how funds will be used, some grantees must consider state laws regarding implementation of certain LIHEAP components. For example, some states have laws in place that require a certain portion of LIHEAP funds to be used for weatherization. They're not allowed to use less than that. Other factors, in addition to federal and state laws, grantees must consider other factors when determining how best to use funds. For example, what is the need? Are we turning away households from one component, heating, in order to keep another? Are we seeing an increase in households with high energy use or inoperable equipment that may warrant more crisis or weatherization services? Climate, are more households requesting LIHEAP during months when the program hasn't typically been offered? That's in northern states, that might be in the summer. Do we have money left over at the end of each heating season that could be used for funding cooling, summer crisis, or year-round crisis programs? So you not only need to consider what your expected needs are, but what has been your experience for the last several years as you finish up your program year? Do you have additional funds? Did you run short in some program? And you need to make sure that you're adapting your state plan each year to address that. So next slide here's kind of an interesting question, and we know that there's been a lot of confusion about this. LIHEAP, I think that OCS has been very good about giving a good, clear answer when people ask the question, but still the question gets asked all the time. So here's the audience poll question number 2. Your approved model plan says that you are not planning to operate a cooling assistance component during this fiscal year. In May, your department finds it is interested in operating a new cooling assistance program for the first time. Are you allowed to implement a new program in this year, even though it wasn't included in your plan? Here are some potential answers. No, you need to wait until next year because you did not mention cooling program in your model plan or during your public hearing. Maybe it depends on if HHS approves this change and allows us to do it or not. Yes, you can make any changes during the year and you don't need to update your model plan or receive public input. Yes, but consult with HHS on obtaining meaningful input related to this change and updating your current model plan. So Roberto's going to put up the poll question. Please make your best assessment of which of these is in fact the appropriate policy. And if you don't know, that's okay. We'll give you the answer and then you'll know. $15 more seconds. Okay, what results did we get for this poll question? So the correct answer is number 4, yes, but we'll need to consult with HHS on obtaining meaningful public participation. Your plan is not a rigid requirement. You've had your public hearing, you've implemented a plan, you've given it to HHS. They have either accepted your plan or they've asked you to look at certain things that they believe are not in compliance. But during the program year, anything could happen. Suddenly propane costs can be dramatically increased. You could have flooding in some area that destroys heating equipment for a large number of low-income households. So you're allowed to make changes in your plan, and you do not, and as long as it's consistent, as long as it's consistent with the LIHEAP program assurances, you will not need approval by HHS. Rather, what you need to do is that would be a substantive change to your program. You need to talk to your liaison about how to get meaningful public participation for changing your plan. And you do have the ability to change the plan if you need to during the program year. That's what it means to have this block grant, and that's what the assurances allow. Charnice, do you have any comments to add about that? Sorry, I didn't.
No, I'm sorry, David. No, I don't at this time.
So that I think one really important thing, particularly this program year, has been that you had additional funding that you maybe didn't anticipate. And so it's important for you to know that you can make changes to your plan if you need to during the program year. One of the things that HHS has recommended in the past is that you have conditional factors included in your plan so that you don't have to go back to the public. I know that, for example, in past years, Delaware had a plan that said that if they had additional funds available during a certain time of the year, they would go ahead and implement a cooling program or a cooling crisis program. I'm not 100% sure which, but I think that kind of conditional funding ideas, I think, was pretty effective in terms of giving them the opportunity to make changes in their program when they need to. That's all I have to offer today. We'll now turn to a presentation by Lisa Gobin to talk about how Oregon implements their program and how they make sure that it's in compliance with the insurances. Note that Lisa is off catching salmon. So either she is very organized and got her plan in early, or perhaps she just left David Kaufman to deal with that. We'll let David tell us later which was true. So this is the presentation that Lisa gave in New Orleans at the NEUAC. Roberto will now play the video of Lisa's presentation.
Great. Good morning, everybody. We already went to the next slide. Okay. Okay, so in this section, we are going to cover how in my state of Oregon, we incorporate federal statute, state law, and other local factors into the design and delivery of our LIHEAP program. So this here, both during and after the session, participants can learn more by visiting the program administration area of the LIHEAP virtual library. David mentioned that a little bit earlier. If you've been around for a while, we used to lovingly refer to it as the bubble chart. It's always stuck in my head as that, but it technically is named the LIHEAP Virtual Library. In order to comply with statute, there are certain common tasks and activities that LIHEAP grantees must undertake each year. These include completing the LIHEAP model plan, otherwise known as our funding application to the feds, executing subgrantee agreements, compiling and submitting required reports. While these tasks may be common among all grantees, the methods used by each state, tribe, or territory to complete such tasks often look very different. Going back to David's slide about the flexibility, this is a little bit more in depth on that. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, the LIHEAP statute requires that grantees submit a model plan each September. The model plan spells out how we as a state will implement the LIHEAP program and assure that the conditions outlined in the federal statute will be met. However, the process of completing our model plan is as important as the plan itself. Assurance 12 of the LIHEAP statute states that grantees must provide for timely and meaningful public participation in the development of the LIHEAP model plan. Many grantees, including us in Oregon, begin working on the model plan in the late winter or early spring, which allows us to have our plan made available to the public with plenty of time to review for comment. So similar to what I spoke to a little bit earlier, by the time we come around to our actual official public meeting, we've already discussed this in depth with almost all of our stakeholders. So some grantees engage local agencies and or major stakeholders to consider new policy and develop revisions to the previous model plan if needed. For example, in Oregon, we typically hold a meeting each spring with our sub-grantees to in-depth review what worked, what didn't work, etc. We also separately review with our utilities as well. And the feedback gleaned from those meetings is exactly what we use in the development of our model plan for the next year and in the review of our statewide policy and procedure manual. Without the input from those groups of folks, we simply can't make the changes necessary or know sometimes what changes we really do need to make. So it's very important to have that open communication with people well in advance, typically of the public meeting. Next slide.
Done. I'm happy.
Other examples of how grantees assure timely and meaningful public participation might include presenting the plan to existing stakeholder groups, advisory committees, etc., holding listening sessions or hearings in geographically accessible locations. My state's very diverse. We have a very urban area and a lot of rural areas. So an option for us could be holding a listening session in the more rural areas where people aren't as actively involved in things. Allowing alternative forms of feedback via email, public webinars, or other online forums. Facilitating community meetings in underserved locations, or asking advocates or gatekeepers, so to say, to sponsor meetings in hard to reach areas. Next slide. Like many states, Oregon opts to use local agencies to deliver LIHEAP services. In Oregon, the state law requires that we use community action agencies for delivery of our LIHEAP program. So we, every year, have the same great people that help us deliver our programs, which actually makes it quite simple for us. Our sub-grantees are required to comply with federal LIHEAP statute and state LIHEAP laws. Therefore, in Oregon, we ask our sub-grantees to submit an annual work plan that is somewhat similar to our state LIHEAP model plan that we complete each year. Among other responsibilities, each local agency is asked to outline how they will comply with assurances related to outreach, which is assurance 3, coordination of services with other service providers, which is assurance 4, and how they assure timely benefits to participants, which is assurance 5. We believe that allowing each of our local sub-grantee agencies to submit their own work plan is advantageous because it gives each agency the flexibility to meet the unique needs of their individual communities. For example, what works in the Portland metro area in the state of Oregon is absolutely not going to work in our rural eastern communities, where I hail from, actually. So it gives them the flexibility to tailor their programs within the guidelines to fit exactly what their community needs based on generally the size and the folks in their area. It also gives us at the state the information needed to conduct thorough monitoring of their programs. While some state policies and procedures that we have are hard and fast, the work plan gives us the details we need to monitor the areas where more flexibility is allowed. Sub-grantees are expected to run their program as they've spelled out in their work plans and submit an amendment if anything major needs to change. While not all grantees ask their sub-grantees to submit work plans, many, including us in Oregon, execute sub-grantee contracts that at a minimum outline budget and allowable expenditures, methods for determining and dispersing benefits, required fiscal procedures and accounting practices, mandatory data collection and reporting, monitoring and auditing procedures that they might have. Assurance 14 says that the grantee must cooperate with the secretary with respect to data collecting and reporting under section 2610 of the LIHEAP Act. So this includes information concerning home energy consumption, the amount, cost, and type of fuels used for households eligible for LIHEAP assistance, the type of fuel used by various income groups, the number and income levels of households assisted, the number of households which received LIHEAP and include one or more individuals who are 60 years or older or disabled or include young children. That one's a mouthful. And the impact of each state's program on recipient and eligible households. In Oregon, we happen to be lucky enough to have a statewide centralized database that all of our subgrantee agencies are required to use. This requirement is outlined in our subgrantee agreement, which we call our master grant agreement. So any programs that we administer with our cabinet agency is covered under that umbrella of the master grant agreement. Our system has a number of canned reports available, as well as some ad hoc reports upon request, both of which are accessible to all of our local subgrantee agencies and state staff. So some of them are just ready for the taking at any given time, but if there is special requests of data that people need, that's just a submission request to us to run a special query. We also have one tribe in our state that opts to use our state database to assure non-duplication of benefits, which is super great because that requirement falls equitably on both us and the tribe. So them using our system gives complete and full visibility of what assistance they might have received in any given program year. We offer that allowability to any of the tribes in our state to use. They're the only ones that have taken us up on the offer, which is great, but it just makes it very simple for that area of folks. And then federally required reports are all run at the state level. The state agency requests LIHEAP performance measure data from energy vendors at the end of each fiscal year to accommodate that report. Assurance 10 says that the grantee must establish procedures necessary to assure to the proper dispersal of and accounting for federal LIHEAP benefits. So Oregon Central Database automatically calculates benefits based on income, fuel type, geography, and other household data entered into our system. One exception to that, however, is in the case of crisis benefits, where the amount is somewhat, give or take, discretionary. However, our system still will put a cap on the crisis amount available. Given this last year of COVID, where everything is kind of crazy and we got to be ready to change hard and fast rules where we can, we also allow for overage exceptions for paying off arrearages, et cetera, which of course has to be approved by us at the state, and then an override process that happens if it's above that cap that the system puts. We also have a state ratepayer assistance program called OEAP, which is also run through the central state database and through our CAP agencies. It allows our subgrantees to easily see what other assistance a household might have gotten besides just LIHEAP. Many of our subgrantees also run any of their local programs. A lot of churches have programs that they ask the agencies to administer assistance to clients, and they're welcome to run those through our local database as well, which is great. So then it shows the full picture of anything that a client or a household might have gotten in any given program year.
Okay, so Lisa told you how one state responds to the different assurances and requirements in developing their program. Now, Teresa, Jane, and Keely are going to show you how each state can do things differently. And they're going to talk about their vendor relationships. So let's go on to the next presenter. Thank you, Teresa.
In this section, we'll cover how 3 states work with energy vendors to assure program integrity and fiscal accountability within LIHEAP. Next slide, please. There are several assurances within the LIHEAP statute that require collaboration with home energy suppliers. Most notable, however, is Assurance 7. Section 2605B7 of the LIHEAP Act 42 USC 8624B7, which states that grantees who choose to pay home energy suppliers directly must establish procedures to 1, make sure the household knows how much of the assistance the vendor has received on their behalf. And that means that each household must receive some form of a notice of action. 2, make sure that the vendor reduces the household's bill by the amount of its LIHEAP benefit and does not overcharge the household. And 3, make sure that the vendor does not treat LIHEAP households adversely or discriminate against LIHEAP households. Next slide, please. In Colorado, the state government signs the vendor agreements, which are renewed every 5 years. We conduct trainings with new vendors annually. We hold annual vendor meetings before the next application period to inform our vendors of any programmatic changes. We also hold information and fact-gathering meetings in the event of more significant changes. For example, the option to pay off arrearages with the ARPA funds. Our program is a lump sum benefit payment paid out each half of our heating season. Vendors are sent monthly payments and are asked to complete a monthly reconciliation report to verify payment. We have 4 large vendors in the state with whom we connect our system with theirs. We hope vendors remember to submit reconciliation reports on time, and we are usually very strongly encouraging them and telling them, hey, you're late, we gotta have this. So they are sometimes a bear to get collected back, but we manage. And we meet with our vendors quarterly through our state statutory mandated Commission on Low-Income Energy and Water, and at our reduced rate payer, this is for metered accounts only program that the state oversees. Next slide. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jane Blank and talk about Wisconsin.
Thanks, Teresa. Hi, yes, so I'm from Wisconsin. I'm the Energy Assistance Manager here in Wisconsin, and I'm going to share a little bit about our vendor relationships, and you'll see some similarities to, as well as some differences to what you heard Teresa share about what they do in Colorado. So we manage the contracts at the state level. So there are some variances out there nationally. Some local agencies actually administer and manage those contracts. In Wisconsin, we manage them at the state level. And then we also have those accessible, those contracts accessible to our local agencies in our centralized system. So they can actually see them if they need to access information. We also have a centralized database or system, as Lisa mentioned, a few have mentioned, and we have something that's programmed into our system called a Wi-Fi call, which is essentially we obtain live account information. So when a customer applies for energy assistance at the local intake agency, they provide them, of course, with their name or the account name, as well as the account number and the address. And then within 3 to 5 seconds, a call comes back with the information of, is the account active, the last 12 months of cost information, as well as usage, so kilowatt hours and therms. It also talks about the status of the account. Are they facing disconnection? Are they currently disconnected? And then that information is actually adopted as long as it looks accurate. The local agency will accept that and then move forward. So it helps the efficiency of the application processing. It also improves the data and program integrity. Our system also, our centralized system also issues all of the payments, all of the refunds, and it's all automated, so it's all built into our system. So if for some reason there's a cancellation of a benefit, we true that up the next time that we pay that vendor, so they don't have to, again, for more efficiencies, so that they don't actually have to cut us a check. So we true things up to make it a little bit easier on our vendors. We also conduct vendor monitoring activities. So we have tools established, processes established, and our goal is to conduct at least one vendor desktop monitoring on at least one of each of the fuel types. Sometimes we do more, sometimes we do less, but that's definitely our goal. And it's been very helpful. The vendors are very cooperative, and essentially what we do is we select components out of the vendor contract to ensure that they're in compliance with the contract. And then lastly, we meet with our investor-owned utilities on a and deliverable fuel vendors on a very regular basis. So we have members from both investor-owned utilities as well as deliverable fuel vendors on our low-income energy advisory committee. We also conduct webinars and sessions. In fact, we're in the phase of doing that right now, and we invited not only our weatherization agencies to attend with our energy assistance intake workers, but we also extended an invitation to some of our investor-owned utilities, and we've had some participate. So that's great. It's just that full collaboration. And then lastly, we do have a public benefit program, so similar to what Lisa said earlier that Oregon has, and it also helps to support that working relationship. I know that, in years past, perhaps still currently, there are some states that still struggle to collect electric information, cost information for performance management. And we are fortunate that we're already collecting that information because of our ratepayer program. So we've had a really good, longstanding working relationship. Thank you.
Hi, Keely Guston here from Dayton, Ohio. I'm going to come at you with a little bit different perspective. I am the former LIHEAP director for a community action agency in Dayton, Ohio. So this is a bit about how it works from the community action level. So when we need to add a new vendor, and we did this just recently a few years ago when we switched our supplier or our vendor for air conditioning units, we're required, we receive paperwork from the state, we go ahead, have them fill out those forms and grant them access to our state system, currently known as OCEAN. And the utilities have a limited, or the vendors have a limited amount of information they can see on there. We can see some of their information on there once it's entered by our intake team. So that's helpful. We're hoping for a bit more of an automated process moving forward. One thing that's been great about this presentation is to see the progress that's been made in other states, and have something to look forward to as we continue to improve our services and our coordination with the vendors. So our agency makes vendor payments, so makes payments for the benefits for their crisis season, summer or winter crisis, for example, directly to our vendors. There are some agencies in the state of Ohio that we're still going through the state for the process, but after this year, they will also make their payments directly. So our fiscal team knows that's going to be a busy time. There's a lot of responsibilities on the plate. We send over a batch report detailing from the state system, detailing what amount of money goes where and how to divide up the nice big check that we send to keep people out of disconnect or restore their services. And then we also enter notes into the state system that both sides can access to let the state know, and perhaps the utility vendor or the vendor, if they have questions, the payment that was made and for what purpose it was made. I think from a community action agency perspective, our vendor relationship, particularly with our main electric provider in our service area, is tremendous. We have a dedicated team that is well-versed not only in LIHEAP, but in our payment plan, our percentage of income payment plan, or PIP, and they know the rules and they understand how to income qualify those clients to keep them utilizing the program and keep them compliant with the program and make sure that they're paying their monthly payments on time and in full the best we can. So it's really a two-way street. We communicate extensively with our vendors via email. We have a very close relationship, again, with select staff members, and that makes it really easy for us to be able to go back and forth when you're working with a team that understands the programs you're providing and is sort of dedicated to you. We receive account information from those same vendors. We can call in and get live account information, which is sometimes helpful to kind of talk it out if an account looks a little bit confusing. Or we can utilize the online portal from our vendors to take a look and say, okay, this is where this client is, this is what it's going to take to get out of disconnect, and this is how much we should pay. So we have a couple of options there. I will say that most of our utility assistance team, we have some very tenured members on the team. They really like to speak with the folks at our utilities over the phone. They're very accustomed to that relationship, and we're just very thankful to have that close relationship with our vendors, because it helps solve a lot of problems when you can get someone on the phone and talk it through. we of course want our state to support, provide additional support to vendors and agencies, help us to better facilitate this relationship in some of the ways that you've already heard about from some of the other amazing states on the call. So, you know, sometimes it can get a little challenging as we're kind of finessing how to coordinate these communications. If the state is made aware of a vendor issue and we weren't looped in on that, we do have some of those calls occasionally. But I think that the three players here, so the state, the community action agencies providing the benefits, and our vendors, we're all working together to streamline that communication, particularly in the wake of COVID, when there is no time to spare. So I'm going to hand it back over.
So what you heard first was Lisa Gobin talking about how they consider all the different LIHEAP assurances as well as their state rules and regulations and their other state programs when they implement their program. And then you heard from Teresa, Jane, and Keely, 3 different states that operate their vendor relationships in 3 different ways. And each of those are perfectly sensible and they work for those states. And so it really shows that you have certain responsibilities, but you also have quite a bit of flexibility. Just in conclusion, the LIHEAP Virtual Library contains resources that provide more comprehensive overview of the federal statute, as well as how grantees incorporate the federal statute, state law, and other factors into their programs. So we encourage you to go out and take a look at that. We have just recently updated all the links for all the latest information. And so there'll be a lot of things there that you might not, if you've gone there before, you might not have seen before. So we're going to go to one final audience poll question, and then we're going to have our Q&A. The final question is, do you think that how helpful do you think it would be to conduct this webinar again next year with LIHEAP Grantee Network? Not helpful at all, not too helpful, somewhat helpful, or very helpful. And it's just fine to be as honest as you wish to be about how useful this was to you and how useful I think you would be to others in the network. So we'll give you 1 minute for that. And if you've completed your poll, we are going to have we're going to move right to Q&A. So you can raise your hand, I believe, to ask questions, or you can enter them in the chat. Okay, so what were the responses? Thank you very much. I think some of you found this a little bit helpful. Some of you found it a lot helpful. That's very useful to know. Now we'll go into the Q&A section. And just so you know that Sharnice, David, Teresa, Jane, Teresa from Colorado, Jane from Wisconsin, Keely from Ohio, and Brian from Washington will all be available to answer your questions. And so next slide. Next slide. So you can go ahead and answer a question by entering a question into the chat. And note that if all you see is this little link here and you can't see how to enter it, you just click on the red arrow and that will that will expand your site, and then you can go to the chat. I don't see any questions yet. So I will ask Teresa and Jane and Keely and Brian So we talked about the idea of actually being able to change your program in the middle of the program year if you find that something has changed and you need to adapt to those changing circumstances. Can any of you identify one or more times when you had to do that in your state, where you either made minor changes because something had changed, maybe like when the propane crisis came through, you had to change your benefit matrix, or when you had major changes, like something happened in your state and you decided to even add a different program component. Anybody want to take that?
This is Brian from Washington. I can take it because I
Go
feel
ahead.
like basically we've been making changes since COVID came out. The important thing to remember is that if you look at the 16 assurances, just remember that LIHEAP is flexible in what we do. And as long as you are not clearly egregious in your actions, you can make changes and implement them and then enter the changes into your state plan. If you want to be cautious, you can make the changes in your state plan and submit for review before implementing those changes. So I've done both. Smaller changes like adding a hardship benefit or an additional benefit to spend out funds is something that many states do and is a fairly easy change. When we started our air conditioning program, that was a big change for us because we're a heating state. That took some back and forth with HHS to make sure all of my components were correct, and what I wanted to do was not clearly egregious to them. So yeah, it's just a matter of doing the entry in OLDC and clicking submit. It really is not a hard thing to do if you've thought out the plan and used your community members and your networks to vet the ideas and the process and the policies. One thing I think Jane said is that we don't make decisions in vacuums. We reach out to our networks in order to ensure that all voices are heard. So that's been my experience with it.
Brian, one question related to that. So yes, adding a program component, you want to make sure that there's meaningful public input, and you have lots of relationships with different kinds of stakeholders. So you can vet those changes for those individuals. Did you do something in addition to people who aren't so involved with the program on a regular basis to get input on your changes?
Yeah, we use our social media network and our social media platform. We're fortunate enough to have a communications office in our department. So when we want to make those changes, we put them on our website and then have our communication department put them out by Twitter and an email blast and an interested parties letter, which really isn't a letter anymore, more of a document that we post and attach to emails. So yeah.
Yeah, the low-income energy advisory committee that I mentioned earlier when I was going through my slide that I mentioned vendors are part of. We also have other agencies that don't directly operate or administer energy assistance, but serve same customers. And so it's an interesting way to get someone sort of an outsider, right, to get some feedback from them as well.
And I would always suggest buy-in for organizations as well. They have a different perspective on different communities that may not have been historically included in decision makings for federal and state programs. So we also have begun that over the past couple of years and making sure that we have buy-in for organization, buy-in to what we're doing.
I think it's important to echo both Jane and Brian here. If you're in a community action agency administering those programs and there's not an infrastructure set up, like a listening group or someone that is reaching out to you for feedback at the state level, don't hesitate to coordinate with your executive director and escalate those concerns. When adjustments are made to the state plan, that feedback, as you've heard, is incredibly vital. So if there are changes you'd like to see, or if you have proposals on how to fix an issue that you're seeing, I think it's really important to take that, self-empowered step at the community action level and communicate with the state to let them know what you're looking at. because a lot of the things that can be quite frustrating in the day-to-day, if you have a way to solve them, I know at least in the state of Ohio, and I know working with these folks here, they're willing to hear it.
Keely, what is the formal way in which they solicit your feedback? Do they just send an email to all coordinators? Do they have a separate group of, where a handful of local agencies are involved? What's the procedure in Ohio?
Yeah, so previously, several years ago, when we were setting up our new system for processing, we had a group of individuals that came together at the state's recommendation or request to work together and provide input there. Now they submit, an opportunity to provide written testimony or, a verbal testimony at our annual public hearing for the state plan. And just recently, the HEAP leadership in the state of Ohio has come together to form a new organization, the Ohio HEAP Leadership Alliance, and we work together to have agencies sign on to a letter that we agreed to about specific changes that the network would like to see. So that sort of collaboration goes a long way as well, I think, when you can pull your agencies together and say, hey, we talked about this, we puzzled it out. Are these a couple options you can consider? This is the first time we've done that, and it is our hope that the state takes that into consideration and is impressed with the coordination on our behalf, certainly.
Yeah, because we have so many contracts and so many agencies that are administering the program in Wisconsin. We don't actually meet with all of them, but we have a work group that cycles through, and we meet with them on a monthly basis. So where we seek input from them, they provide us, so we solicit feedback, whether we're considering a policy change, or just if it's something that they came up with we hadn't even thought of. So yeah, putting a work group like that together has been very helpful in Wisconsin.
Charnice, I think I don't see any questions, so we must have been terribly, terribly clear. Charnice, would you like to wrap up and say thank you to the presenters and the attendees?
Yes, thank you so much, David. And thank you for everyone who has joined the webinar. I would like to thank all of our participants, all of our speakers, everyone who gave a different perspective from their program. If anyone does have any questions that just hasn't hit them yet, but maybe sometime after the webinar, please feel free to give us send us an email or a follow-up, and you have our contact information at the very last slide. So feel free to reach out, and thank you so much for joining us today. All right, bye everyone.
Bye, thank you.